All right, so let's go to part 3 here. Little reminder, part 1, we talked about the evaluation that we used on an elite level, competitive powerlifter, heavily muscled, history of low back pain, history of shoulder pain, we had knee pain, a lot of things, and it was in the context where I think he was frustrated with a lot of things that he'd been doing and came to a seminar and got even more frustrated. There was no evaluation done, and a lot of the exercises that are really good exercises and no comments on the and negative comments on the utility of those types of exercises. But obviously you go to a course, you're going to get highlighted those exercises rather than what this individual really needed. And of course there was no evaluation, which was pretty, frustrating to see. So we moved into, we talked about this is what we're seeing. These are the unique limitations. Part 2, and it really relates into where we're going to go here with part 3. I gave you a window into some of the exercises that we used as almost a part of the evaluation. When there are mobility limitations, some of the closest in power to manual therapy, which we do not expect to be a long-term fix, we do expect that there could be a dramatic response very, very quickly. And really what we're trying to establish with whether it's manual therapy or in this case those Eldoa exercises that have a very, very expansive breadth of what they can potentially impact in terms of the nervous system for a heavily stiff individual, is to demonstrate that, hey, if we can do this and then the joint is exposed to be able to show us what it can do from A to B, well then we're going to suggest, well, hey, if a little bit made us this little bit better, then imagine what a lot would do. And then we might actually change the attack points. We can still use those exercises. I don't think they're going to get us everything. I'm just picking what I think is the most powerful exercises. And in this case, for somebody who's really stiff and really muscled, those would be the ones that we would choose. So we looked at the SC. I don't recall that the AC really did anything, so we didn't put that one in place. And then we looked at Eldoa of hip internal and external rotation. So we're going to put that into play here, and if we can get some engagement and some questions, there's no reason why we can't film all of these different things. But there's a path here that we didn't really weave, if you will, from the first evaluation. Because number one, it wasn't the time or the place to spend 2-3 hours with this individual, and there's so much. When you have this, I mean, it just explains that when you have so much stuff going on. I even said dude, I could think of like 300 exercises that I think might all have value on paper. So we could put a lot figuratively on paper here, but again, you just got to pick and choose. And when you have a good radar and you have good focus of what you're trying to change with these drills, well then the ones that pop out at you are the ones that are going to create the biggest change. And there can be anything. That's really what I was really, I know we talked about in part 1. I'm not going to be the one doing the therapy. I'm not going to be done doing the coaching at a general level or a specific level. I'm just there at that point, just giving advice, and I'm bailing. And I got some content, some real world information here that I can put on for SageSpot. So let's look at where we were at in terms of the shoulders. We were going to prioritize forward bending and rotation. I think the redundancy that we get from forward bending and rotation will probably beget some of the things that we want from backward bending, and then we're going to let it ride. There was knee pain, but I think I think it's going to fall part and parcel here with the rotation piece. And there's obviously other things that you can get into. A mulligan taping strategy would probably be of use for that knee, looking back a little bit. All right, let's take a look here. So when we looked at the shoulder, we looked at the quick fixes. We looked at the SC joint. I think that created some movement. We looked at glenohumeral eldoa, neutral on neutral. I probably stick with the SC joint and then run the therapy that would be concurrent to that in terms of subclavius, pec minor, medial pec, etc., or maybe even other types of eldoa in that area. So I'd stick with that. So we're going to look at the SC. Now, I probably would not go to the glenohumeral eldoa, and there's a couple reasons. Number one, he had neural symptoms. So clearly, when you throw what really does look like a general neural tension, even if you're keeping your neck in neutral, chin back, neck packed if necessary, and you still get the tingling in that general pattern, I think we absolutely need to go to some general or median nerve. And maybe if we used Michael Shacklock terminology, we would call that a level 2 or a tensioner. And all the therapy that comes along with that. I'm going to put the glenohumeral eldoa off a little bit. We can still get into the AC, but it didn't really get us anything. Doesn't mean that it's not a useful thing to do, but it would probably fit more in maybe a cool down. Because if we have so much going on here in terms of special exercises that we should be as precise as possible. We're not just hitting stuff just because we think it's involved. There's enough here that we do know. So now when you have the general median nerve or the level 2 tensioner, then we've got a lot of soft tissue work to get after. And that's really where we're going to generate a lot of exercises here. I think we're going to have to get into some pneumomuscular reflex, meaning we're going to get into a position of very, very high tension, as maximum length as we can, and we're going to look to target mobilizing the pec major. We're going to look to mobilize the lat. We're going to look to mobilize the trap, scalenes, levator, anything that possibly can be a part of allowing more bandwidth. Now remember also on that right side there was an elbow issue. There was a biceps tear tendon that had been repaired. We did not evaluate that. So in theory we should be looking at even therapy at both heads of the biceps, maybe 20 to 100 repetitions of some curls, which I think can fit into our general physical preparation, our work capacity that we'll get to in phase 4. But ultimately where we're starting here, we're going to stick with the SC and we're going soft tissue mobilization strategy to set up our neural approach. Because in my mind, if the nerve doesn't get that length, well then nothing else matters. So we've got to be able to get the nerve length and maybe find where that compression might be and increasing bandwidth. Then once we normalize, in this case, medial rotation extension on both sides, we're going to be there. So you got the global muscles like the pec, the lats, the traps. But I do think you can put this individual into positions of shoulder internal and external rotation and run some of these strategies. Now, I'm leaving out names of commercial models because a lot of them are really, really good. And I think as long as you maintain high levels of tension, no more tension that you can't breathe, I think if we add the breathing in place with high tension, high strategies that do relate to what this individual is limited in, I think we're going to be in good shape. So that's where we start with the shoulder. Now, if we think that this neural component is significant, which right now I've got no reason to say is not, then we have to get into the neck, okay? And then the next phase of the growth, because this is now, we're already up to maybe literally 20 exercises. And if we're holding for 30, 60 seconds or more, depending on where we're at with these exercises, when's this dude ever going to have time to train or other job or whatever? So there's a lot going on. We've got to really be precise and pick and choose. If we can get some of our CT junction stuff, So now you got your Aldoa of 7-1. You've got the Levitt technique, or maybe you've seen in other models where we're reaching, and then you throw the neck involved there. So again, nobody owns anything. It's just a matter of where you heard it first, so you attach that name to it. So I think if we can go there, I think if we can look at some of the side bending of the neck and thoracic, I think we can get some. Also, even if we get into some hemithorax for flexion or rotation, we'll get some redundancy there. So when we look at the high cervical, including if we have shoulder pain, then you got to go to C5. So let's go to 4-5 and 5-6. Good news, those are almost identical positions to where you would see in 3.5 months from DNS. So it's you're doing different arm positions with the rules of fascial tension. But again, you just got to go by something. What do you believe? If we do one, not the other, I don't think it makes a difference. Let's just create these changes. So we're answering lots of different calls, and we're making our own chains here, where if we now have a symptom in the fingers, we've got to run that nerve all the way up to the brachial plexus. And if you're feeling it there, well, then we probably should be thinking about C5, potentially C6 or C7. So now you're going to run down those three chains. So now you got Aldoa 4-5, 5-6, 7-1. Hell, you might as well just do 6-7. But now you're up to 4 minutes up to when you're handling those things. So where does that fit into the program? I don't know any of these things yet. When somebody's looking to squat 1,000 pounds and they're all jacked up and they can barely break parallel, you have a lot of questions to answer. We talked about even in the Instagram runner to this case study, when you're running everything sagittal and you've got all these unilateral issues, these asymmetrical issues, but then you create elite levels of symmetry by closing the chain on the bar and closing your chain with your feet to the ground, and then putting huge compression through the spine. You're asking for something to get torqued. You're asking for things to be tensioned on one side, less tensioned on the other, open on one side, close the other. When you hit that closing angle, we're going to start to see some tissue issues, in my opinion. Something is not going to go right when the joint is open on one side and closed on the other for a significant period of time, where now the degrees of freedom are now locked. There's nothing wrong with opening and closing a joint system. It's more about, are you forced to do that? So it's not about good or bad movement. Of course, it's bad when you're locked in that position. Of course, when the execution of load and relevant fitness or acute variables forces these things to happen, then of course it's a bad exercise. Very strange how people would say, oh, there's no such thing as a bad exercise. Really? Well, how come when most people do XYZ under XYZ conditions, something not so good happens? So we would really, I'm saying for the first few weeks, if I was going to be involved in therapy here, we would look at soft tissue of the neck, soft tissue of the shoulder. Let's get some of that neural tension, and then let's focus on at least the SC joint, a bit largely because that gave us a good degree of a dramatic level of improvement. So there's a lot there. Warm up at the neck, side bending, etc. Forward bending. It was, as an athlete, as somebody that reaches to the floor, here's an individual that was very skilled at forward bending, but had very, very poor components. I mean, probably almost a 40 to 50 degree flexion. Everything was rough. So let's just go through this real quick of where we would buckshot, because we didn't break it down. He was probably going to have something of everything. Okay, so the first place we would go is we would look at, if you can't touch your toes, well then you would look at seated toe touch. And that would lead us to hip weight bearing stability. That's actually probably where we'll finish with this package. We're going to do everything else beforehand. So now we're going to, let's say if you're in a seated toe touch and you can't touch your toes, where would you go to next? You'd go to active straight leg raise. and let's just see where he's at. Then we would go to active straight leg raise plus core activation. And in his case, we did see a change. So we do need to be into whether even it might just be active straight leg raise with core activation as one of his warm-up exercises and or cool downs. And then how can we support that from therapy? Now we would also look at passive straight leg raise, and in this case we would actually get into that same level 2 tensioner before we would get into the soft tissue work there. So when we saw the improvement with core activation, it wasn't like this went to 90 degrees where that is a hip that should be able to touch her toes. We just saw a change. So we know that core activation's on board, but we also know that passive tension was on board. And just like with the shoulder, when we see passive tension first, let's at least clear the nerve beforehand. Well, how do you do that with active straight leg raise? Whether you're using core activation or not, when you're prone and you are dorsiflexed, you're going to look at a particular degree of excursion. Now, the next step would be to maintain that degree of hip flexion with knee extension. Planar flex the foot. Is there sensation of tension decreased? Well, then it's not the hamstring alone. Can they actually move further? Remember, if you have a decreased sensation of tension, the hamstring didn't change its length. You just changed the gastroc, which we do know crosses the knee. So if the hamstring goes from your ischial tuberosity to the posterior knee, south of the posterior knee, and all of a sudden it moves more, but by changing the position of the foot, it couldn't be the hamstring. What could it be? It could be the general sciatic nerve tension, the general neural tension, because that does go from the ischial tuberosity. It actually goes further north, all the way down through the bottom of the foot up and spreads into the toes. It could also be the calf itself, but let's just clear the nerve. But that's how you'll be able to break passive straight leg raise into a myofascial component, which you could use any kind of your pneumomuscular reflex stretches. You got your myofascial stretching in the abdomen. You've got all different types of get there and move in 3 planes around it. All these things can be very, very useful. But as somebody who's been there and done that, I've been blessed by unique hip mobility, so having these length issues never really been a huge problem for me. Powerlifters don't do this. Like it's just especially when they don't have the unique retroverted hips that allow them to squat really, really wide. But again, we're looking at that passive straight leg raise. You're looking to compartmentalize myofascial and neural. That's a big thing. When you have consistency where there's stiffness across the board and you bucket that into mobility, there's really still 3 things that could be. Number 1 is a myofascial component. Number 2 is a neural component, and they both might be red herrings where it's neuro-locked. And even though it is consistent across the board, if a breathing strategy or a relaxation strategy changes the motion of the joint, it couldn't have been either of those types of limitations because they don't change just by breathing. They don't change from this immediate adjustment to the neurological systems. They are mechanical things, and but while there's 2 different between myofascial and neural, nerves don't like to be mobilized the same way as the myofascial component. I don't know if you're stretching the fascia or the muscle, so I'm calling it myofascial. That's where you put time under tension. You put a tense nerve and time under tension, you're going to start getting some tingling, you're going to start getting some discomfort. So please, report them. Like, it's okay if you're trying to learn some new things. Remember, nerves and myofascia and muscles don't necessarily respond to the same levels of adaptations. Okay, and then of course we've got to go looking at, which we've talked about in other posts here. We have to look at the uniform spinal curve. Okay. And that's where I think this individual is definitely going to need to get into some curl-ups. We're definitely going to need to get into breathing in a very rounded back position. Some focused, obviously, therapy. I'm going to be partial to dry needling at this piece, and I know I can be at segmental levels, but let's see if we can get as much flexion through there. Now, what are we after here? Now, if this individual can't touch their toes, you got to be of the belief that they are leaving something on the table in terms of a hinge, and this is a fairly close stance squatter, so he's not going to be sitting way back. But also, even if he's satisfied what appears to be mechanically getting to depth, coach says, yeah, I like what that looks like, I want that. Well, what we need to actually, which you cannot eyeball, I'm not even sure how you would actually measure this, but is the femoral head gliding and sliding posteriorly? Because if it's not, then you're going to have this relative anterior weight shift, and then no surprise that this individual has significant 3-4 and 4-5 symptoms. History of just blown out discs. Great news, whatever therapy he had been doing, it probably did a great job of allowing enough healing, because whatever terrible looking toe touch he has no pain. That's brilliant. That's going to give us at least a warranty to get into a lot of things and just see what works. Even that might be a 2 to 3 week process. Good news, I really believe that just trying a whole bunch of stuff over 2 to 3 weeks that he's never done will probably get him to a place. Now, additionally, when you have these terribly asymmetrical shoulders, you're going to figure out a way to get under the bar, which he did. He looked great. He looked like a competitive powerlifter. But now I think that could also, when you're limited, you can only go so far out on the bar. At which point, the further you go out on the bar, the less down your back you can get it. Now everybody's a little bit different, but for any given movement, if I'm going to hold the bar all the way out here, I can't get it down my back nearly as far. If I can't get it down my back nearly as far, the distance between the bar and 5-1, which is the best fulcrum to break from putting load up the spine, is larger. So if you're essentially putting more torque and potentially strain in any direction, how the person figures it out is up to them. The compression is there, but the strain can be compensated for through flexion or shearing, both of which can significantly load up 3-4, 4-5, 5-1, wherever. So we need to normalize those shoulders to take load off the spine, maybe get the bar a little bit lower so it doesn't create that dump forward where you're just starting underwater, and unless you've got incredible connective tissue, this individual obviously did not. Otherwise he wouldn't have broke. So, and look, when we're talking about these loads, breaking is kind of part of the game, and I think I'm glad that he's going to take a year here to really rebuild and go after a grand, rather than saying, I need to compete in a few weeks or something like that. So we're going to look at everything here, and I do think, if we got into, and of course ultimately, this could wind up being like a 70-minute general work capacity program of all of these special exercises for movement. You could truncate that down and do a whole bunch of 10 or 15-minute ones. We're not necessarily improving high levels of work capacity, but we might get a little bit of eccentric heart. We're certainly going to improve efficiencies, but this is, I think, these are going to be answers to really having high levels of efficiency when we get into training. But so here is where we probably begin with some kind of on your back, whether it's our leg raise approach. I like whether you have a strap or you can straddle a pillar or the doorway, where one leg is maximized with dorsiflexion, knee extension, hip flexion, and then the other leg is able to go up and down. Let's keep in mind that when that down leg, when you're doing active straight leg raise, when that down leg is much more comfortable when it's abducted or externally rotated. Remember, it should look like this. You should be able to maintain neutral and dorsiflexed. That's where some hip flexion is going to come into play. All right? So that's where we need to mobilize hip flexors, to be able to then regain ideal centration and a neutral pelvis. I'm talking blue sky here. I don't know what's going to work here, but when you see a toe touch that looks that limited, all of these things are going to probably be on board in some way. And then getting into, once you're there, then we get up into half kneeling. We can get into oblique half kneeling, getting more of the hip flexion. But I think as you get closer and narrowing the stance, proprioception, awareness, inline half kneeling packages is really, once he can do that, that means he's got that neutral pelvis, and now we're just getting better and stronger and more fit at stabilizing it, okay? So I think the only thing maybe I didn't get to up here is once we have some degree of satisfaction for where we're getting with the shoulder. So once we're satisfied, or getting more satisfied where we're getting in forward bending, then you get up into the stabilization that I just mentioned. The stabilization strategies for the shoulders would be side lying. There's a nice package that we have where we're side lying and we're reaching, where we can mobilize the posterior shoulder. But even just hanging in 6 months side lying, not hanging position, but just hanging out. Just like some people would push you into lying on your back, knees bent, hips flexed to 90, breathe. Well, if you could also do that in sideline, you can do that in prone, you can do that in a lot of different positions. If we can get on that one side here, I think that's where we would try to link all that together from a very simple concept. Get some mobility, lock it in with some stability. So we would bring that here. And then, as we said, we would look at ER and IR. Is there anything else that we would put into that? Yes. We could look at hemithorax into rotation. You could look at your 4x4. I don't think we're going to get a lot of action from him 4x4 unless it was with passive overpressure, meaning somebody else was pushing him, doing some active assisted, and holding that end range. I think we would probably need to take more of a neurological approach. Hemithorax with rotation, maybe look at some, even just start with C6, 7, where you're sitting with legs crossed, hands are in a prayer position, and you're reaching up to the ceiling. That would actually fit into rotation, because I think once you get into the lower thoracic, 6, 7, 7, 8, 8, 9, 9, 10, again, it's one of the things that I struggle with is it seems like, so you basically have to do everything. They're like, yeah. Well, no, you don't have to do everything all the time. But when you have a significant amount of mobility limitations everywhere, which should give you the reason why somebody who's incredibly strong and incredibly skilled is now injured. So let's fill in the gaps that are of most significant loss, and that's where we're at. In mobilization of the shoulders, mobilization into forward bending, and mobilization into rotation. It doesn't mean you don't train, but now the dance that I'm not sure how the song is going to go, the dance in part 4 that we'll get after here is how can we train? How can we hide from these significant enough limitations and allow these special exercises to create adaptations? Can we at least get 3 steps forward and 2.5 steps backwards while we still can develop great strength and also create a psychological environment that this lifter is still getting a chance to be who he is? I think that's to take away what somebody wants to do. I don't think he's going to die. I could say that I don't think he's going to enjoy his experience. He already hasn't. This is how I think we can fill in how you want to do it. You want to enjoy powerlifting. You want to get up to a grand. These are the reasons that I think you can get that you can't do it, and here's why I think you can get there. But ultimately, I think this is really where we need to go. And if we get some engagement, we ask some questions here in the comments below, and then we'll maybe make a video or some content even just one, or maybe really dial in really what we're trying to accomplish with even just some of the exercises that we showed before, and what we're really trying to accomplish with each of these particular things, and we'll do it out of context. A lot of the content right now is in context, so I can just try to give you a window into how I think and how you can organize all the different techniques and methods that you have into a very systematic way of thinking. So now let's digest this for a minute. We'll come back for part 4, where we'll very simply talk about how I think the training process can be lateralized. Here's our regressions. The lateralizations is what we'll talk about in phase 4.